Welcome back to the Stirrings podcast. This is your host, Madeline Lee, and today we're going to talk about robots. Now, this might seem a little strange considering in the last episodes we spoke about speaking with plants and moving with the myriad rhythms of time. But as we live in an increasingly digital, technology-filled world, it's worth taking a moment and doing an exploration of the technologies humans build. As I do with my consultancy company, Wayseeing Ethics, I like to look at not only the technology itself, its design, how it works, its function, but also jump out to these sort of wide scale observations on how these technologies interact with our economics, our politics, our socializing, our education, our spirituality. So this is the approach I take. It's intimate and wide-ranging. When we're looking at robots, we're looking, yes, at the machine, but also of automation, predictability, and efficiency. Let me take you back to Delft in the Netherlands. This is where I did my PhD in the ethics of robotics. And there was one day about halfway through my time there where I found myself looking up at the dreary, drizzly, gray Dutch sky, asking the universe, what the F am I doing here? And the universe replied quite clearly, even sternly, said, trust the path I led you on. Trust the path I led you on. And so I put my head down and walked through the door because I'm the daughter of two mystics, and they have taught me that when the universe speaks so clearly, you just do as you're told. I went on to finish the PhD, strange as it felt to be there as a philosopher, as somebody trained for 10 years in spiritual care. How come robots remain so interesting is because I'm always interested in how the people around the robots are moving, are adapting and making accommodations for the technology. And robots now, with humanoid robots coming out likely in the next few years, which I'll speak about, they may be in schools, hospitals, streets, delivery cars, and companions in our homes. Certainly, this technology will be shifting the many landscapes that humans inhabit. And also our capacity to connect with everyone around us, both human and non-human. So it's not just about the robots, about AI, about quantum computing, about whatever sort of cutting edge technology you want to fill in there. It's also about the whole atmosphere and ground and layered soil that surrounds it and makes this technology possible. So we'll dive into a little bit of that through the episode. But first, I want to offer some words from Nora Bateson, the wonderful, just so inspiring, moving, thought-provoking thinker. And she writes these words, which I am going to repeat now and at the end of the episode, almost as a blessing over the episode or an incantation, a spell that I'm casting to stir a sense of aliveness and maybe out of some of those robotic flows that you may have gotten into. Nora Bateson writes, I am not made of cubes. I am a beast, a vermin astray. There is wildness still coursing through my veins, sinking me to life. It is from here that I hope to learn from life. I am not made of cubes. I am a beast, a vermin astray. There is wildness still coursing through my veins, sinking me to life. It is from here that I hope to learn from life. Let's get into it. So the universe said, trust the path I led you on. But I did have to go back and think exactly what that path was. I'm trained in philosophy and spiritual care. As I said, it was a bit unusual that I ended up working in a robotics lab in the Netherlands. Then I remembered this almost scientific pursuit of robot ethics was sparked, in fact, by something probably unscientific in the Western viewing. It was by a vision. When I was 18 years old, I began volunteering with a small charity in Toronto. It was called Boarding Homes Ministry. Boarding Homes Ministry was run by this feisty, crusty, fiercely loving chaplain, Reverend Roger Hunter. He would say things like, I only go to the church if I'm paid, and preferred instead driving around the streets of Toronto, doing the work of what I can only describe as this profound gift of recognition, care, and companionship. I will speak more detail about all of that in a later solo episode. But for now, you should just know that I spent every Wednesday for the better part of a decade with Roger. And we would often be in and out of hospitals, hospices, nursing homes, alleyways, and boarding homes, which are equivalent to maybe a rooming house, which might be more familiar to you. And during that time, I saw all range of types of institutional care. There was one in particular, we were visiting a man who had been living in boarding homes and on the street and through jail all of his life and ended up in a nursing home. The setting was like any Canadian nursing home I've been to. Lots of elderly people staring at the TV, some posters indicating a bingo night and some exercise classes, and nurses, competent, caring in their own way, and very, very busy. Running through with a clipboard, not having a lot of time to sit and chat with anyone. When I looked around and saw, instead of the human nurses, I saw robot nurses. After all, there was such little time for the nurses there to engage in what we might consider human care. The sitting with, the holding hands, the just listening and being quiet with one another. And so it wasn't actually that much of a jump to imagine that a robot could probably do what they were doing as well. Moving quickly through a space, handing out medication, moving people from one place to another. And in this vision, I also had a deep knowing, which was that the type of care will depend on your income bracket. The wealthy will always have bespoke human care. They will never be denied human touch. But here, in this nursing home that houses people who were previously unhoused, or barely housed, or intermittently housed, they'll get the robots. It'll be more cost efficient at some point in the future. So this vision took hold within what I already knew to be true about institutional care, which is that if you're poor, you don't have a lot of choice. There was another more specific and intimate aspect that drew me into the study of robots. I had been doing research at the time on the philosophy of touch and the ethics of touch within care settings. What I was researching and what I was seeing and experiencing myself is that there is such a profound difference and feeling of professional touch and intimate touch. And we're told those two cannot mix. And so anytime I got touched at the doctor, I always just felt like I was being touched like an object, not like a very specific, a very particular, a very unique human body that deserved attention and even reverence. Doctors and nurses do not have time for reverence. They do not have time for this sort of deep care. They're moving through patient after patient, just trying to get through to the end of the day. And in their medical, they're also taught to maintain a professionalization of touch, no feeling, no care, because we don't want to get into the murky area of inappropriate touch, transgressive touch. And so the fearfulness around lawsuits and the very real reality of abuse is then shut down by maintaining a feelingless, careless kind of touch. This I was noticing just between humans. And I thought, what happens when it's no longer human hands touching us, but a robot? A robot that only senses itself through cameras, temperature, friction, or force. What are we going to lose when we eliminate the haptic connection between humans, even if it's still this very professionalized, sterilized kind of touch? And I could just see the people that I would visit every Wednesday being left only to have robot touch. The horror and shudder that I felt when I was envisioning all of this led me into doing a PhD in the ethics of robotics. When I went to Delft University of Technology to study robotics, I was on a team with 4 other engineers, and then I was the philosopher. And you can imagine that I was very scared going into the first meeting, thinking that I wouldn't understand anything they were talking about, and I would have to ask for definitions, and I would really be the odd person out. And what was fascinating was that that didn't end up being true, because what I learned about robotics is that it takes so much to make a robot work, so many specific expertise. And so in that first meeting that I had with my colleagues, I saw them asking each other, well, what does that mean? And what does this mean? And from that moment, I realized the complexity of making a robot work. What was very helpful also is that I came to understand what is possible and what is not possible for robots. When we're speaking about robots, many of us are thinking about some range between a Terminator, something in Star Wars, a robot butler, or Wall-E. And what I was seeing was far less impressive. I had some of my colleagues focusing on trying to get the robot just to move through a space without hitting anything. Others were trying to get the robot to pick up a banana and would spend 4 years on this very difficult task. And so during that time, I realized we're pretty far off from having robots in our homes. And I just want to say, for now, we'll speak about that in a moment, but I no longer take that to be true. Listening to the roboticists was fascinating as well. I think that there's an idea as an outsider, as a non-engineer, that engineers tend to focus solely on the technology and not on humanity, or they have some sort of simplistic version of humanity. But what I found when I listened with a spirit of greater generosity was something far more interesting. I would hear colleagues poring over the physical and social complexity of dealing with an open fridge at a supermarket. You might close it right away, but you might also look around to decide if anybody was there. Do you close it from behind, or do you walk past it and close it? There's actually quite a lot that goes into deciding this within a social dynamic of something like a supermarket. Now, it's interesting when we compare this to humans figuring out how to close a door at a supermarket, is that unless we're learning something very specific and step-based, like a particular skill, like dancing or playing the piano, when it's more of this social movement, it's something that we get infused with without having somebody instruct us exactly. We're doing so much as children in way of observation and mimic. I remember one time when a colleague came by to hold my 3-month-old baby. When she was sitting in his arms, she was wiggling the whole time. And he eventually said, "We could never afford this." We could never afford this. And that's because she was moving all the time, 24/7, learning how to understand her body and what it was capable of, how far it could reach, where it could roll. There was never a moment, even in her sleep, where she was not learning that. So, no, they can't afford that. The computational cost would be too much. But there's so much other cost here. To have a child that feels safe to move, feels safe in her explorations. Her life itself relies on the love between my husband and I, the desire we had for children, the bravery we had after a miscarriage, the breaths I took to have a safe birth, the times, the hours we spent in the dark, walking. And so the cost of her learning to move in her environment is infinite, nonsensical. There is no number for that. The robot that learns in the lab, beginning hard coded and slowly moving into something perhaps more generative, that is not the same as a human body, a human baby growing over time and understanding its cultural, social world. But I'm not convinced we always need to be doing these comparisons between humans and robots. Robots are robots, humans are humans. I don't think we need to get too worked up over the exact distinction and what's human and what's robot. So I want to draw you back to this assumption I made. I was thinking robots are not going to be out in the world very soon. Like, they're not that good. Like, certainly the robots in our houses is not a thing. Because there is this interesting paradox when we're looking at AI and robotics, is that robots are very good in specific situations. For example, where they have been for many decades now in the factory doing a very specific job on the line. Also, not moving very much, very local. Robots can do that repetitively, consistently, over time, 24 hours a day, if you can pay the energy bill. What robots have traditionally not been good at is generalizing, moving about in the world, which is filled with humans and then non-humans, making all sorts of mess of things. Unpredictable, surprising, spontaneous, very hard for a robot to adapt. And so in the last years, when you've seen a robot maybe in an airport, or sometimes they have robots in like a restaurant or something, is that the robot is often sort of frozen. It starts and it stops and it moves left and then it moves right. And it can get sort of stuck in a corner, for example. And that's because it's been designed to never hit anyone. Then your investments go way down. So moving around out in the wild, outside of the lab, is really hard for robots to adapt to. So I thought, we're a long way off. But lately, I've been taking my eye off the robot a bit more and looking at the spaces we're creating, at the ways we're moving around in the spaces, how we're speaking to one another, how we're organizing our lives into tidy little blocks. And I thought, and I've been thinking, we are becoming pretty predictable. We are becoming pretty scripted. We are moving in straight lines in big box stores a lot. A robot might be able to handle this. Yes, because there have been advancements in robotics in the last years with the actual material of the robot, but also with the software. Yes. However, there's also been this other movement where we have become more robotic. And so has our environment and our spaces. The spaces that we have, just think grocery stores, bright, shiny, clean floors with wide aisles. everyone pretty much the same. You can walk into kind of any chain grocery store and understand the basic layout, quite unlike a market space or a small co-op, for example. Schools, elementary schools, any one of them built since the 60s or 70s kind of looks the same unless it's a alternative school. Same thing, shiny, sterile, cleanable floors, wide aisles, no curves. The layout is, again, pretty understandable. You can go into a school and figure it out pretty quickly. It's predictable. I also think of the many houses I've been in and the condos as well. They too are smooth, wipeable materials that are the same in Toronto as they may be in Amsterdam, as they may be in Beijing, from the same stores, from the same corporations. Predictable. Hmm? Quite predictable. Temperature. The same. Temperature control. We have the AC in the hot summers and the warmth in the winters. I know that this is a particularly North American thing, but I've experienced it all over the world more and more. And so we lose sense of the passing seasons and the need to adapt to the world around us, to the planet and its movements. Many of these places feel almost timeless, not only in the seasonality, but the lack of windows, or maybe the windows are covered up as it is in supermarkets. Not only are we not moving with the seasonality in that rhythm, but also with just the rising of the sun and the setting of the sun, the light is always the same inside. It really reminds me of a casino. I have been in two casinos in my life, and both times I have this strange feeling of being transported into an alternate universe. You don't know how long you've been there, you don't know the passing of the day. It's sort of this design of any sort of international corporate hotel with the carpets and their strange but also predictable designs. And the music here is the same as a hotel lobby there. As we inhabit these places more and more, our movements themselves become more predictable. I'm thinking again of the grocery store where the self-checkout kiosks are now the norm. And when I go into one of these stores, which I don't do very often, but when I do go into a giant grocery store, I am often overwhelmed by all of the choices, but not a lot of choice by way of movement, of communication. Everything is quick. And when you get into a space like that, you want to be quick too. Like, God forbid somebody talk to you in a grocery store aisle, or that the cashier talks too much. That would be very annoying. And in fact, you didn't even want to go to the cashier because what you really wanted to do was go to the self-checkout kiosk, because there, thankfully, you could just check out and not be bothered by anyone else. Is this not true? I think, at least for many people listening, this will resonate. This just want to get in, want to get out, you want to get home, and you just don't want any sort of disruption in your flow. You are like a factory of grocery shopping. And so, while there is a tendency with technology to focus on the newness of it, the cutting edge of it all, of robots, of AI, I am always quite interested in not only what's new, but like, where is it emerging from? And what I have found in these investigations is that the cutting edge technologies are really not that much of a break from what already is. A robot is kind of the next step. It already makes sense. Our places are already ready for them. And so are we. We don't want to have long, meandering conversations. We want to listen to presentations that have 5 takeaways so that it's clear. We want to get to the point. We're optimizing so much of our human connection and our ways of moving around in the world that I can understand that a robot would be really kind of a relief as a colleague, as an educator, as a doctor, as a nurse. It would just kind of like close off all of that messy human stuff. And when that's closed off, that's kind of great too, because we don't have to risk embarrassing ourselves or being vulnerable or saying the wrong thing or hurting somebody's feelings or having our own feelings hurt. We can just sort of smooth over all the messiness of that. It is appealing. I don't pretend it's not, but I just ask, like, what are we missing? What are we letting go of? It is profound. The ways that we communicate are increasingly based on scripts. Whole businesses make their money off of building scripts to speak to somebody who's depressed or somebody whose parent just died, or making a sales pitch, talking to your teacher, getting a raise, renegotiating your phone bill, talking to your children. These scripts are also within this wider trend of optimizing our communication. I have such trouble anytime I start using a new software or I just like getting a new email. I got a new computer and I have to go in on each one of these things and just turn off the recommendations that are automatically made for making my language more concise, is usually the one. What's important here is that it's very hard to unsee something once you've seen it. It's very hard to get it out of your head when something on the side of your email says, you can make this 70% more concise. Now you're worried about being more concise, being more optimized in your communications. On this very platform I use for my podcast, there is on the back end when I'm doing editing, it says how many pauses there are, of which there are so many, especially in the guest interviews. And there's also the ums and the ahs and the hmms and the likes that you can get rid of. It is so tempting to just press that and be done with it. And I do admit that I take some of those out so that there's a better flow to the conversation. But I do it manually because if we take all of that out, we're left with a horrifically robotic kind of conversation. So that's with our communication. Our movements, too. This is an interesting one. I was recently having a chat with Tom Hirons, who is in the next episodes, a wonderful poet, deeply moving, thoughtful person. And we met on Zoom. Neither of us can figure out how to shut off the camera that follows you on Zoom. We're not very tech savvy, I suppose. And so while we're talking and waving our arms and waxing poetic, the camera is zooming in on our faces and moving back. And Tom has been struggling with this for a while, I guess. And he said that he just tries not to move too much so that the camera won't follow him. We had a good laugh about this, but I've been thinking about it since, is that these technologies that we have that increasingly use sensors to adapt to our movements, it's not only shaping the technology's movement, it shapes our own. So we sit quieter on Zoom, flailing our arms less to avoid embarrassment. You might be shifting the way that you work to work alongside a robotic colleague that moves at a consistent, inhuman pace, but you move within that rhythm, eventually feeling your humanity because, of course, you can't keep a consistent pace over time. Maybe there's robots on the street soon. Delivery robots, for example. You may go over to the other side for fear of being caught on camera or as a resistance to the possibilities of mass surveillance. Power to you. And yet many of us will do something more subtle. We'll adapt. We'll accept it. And at first, we'll be irritated. We'll think, ugh, this robot's stuck in the middle of the sidewalk again. So annoying. But as we see them and they become more familiar, and as their technological capabilities increase and they get better at being on sidewalks, we'll figure out how to walk beside them. We'll figure out how to move around them. We'll figure out how to speak to them in short and concise sentences with a sort of international Silicon Valley accent so as not to confuse it. We'll dull the edges of our humanity so that it is palatable and sensible and legible to the machine. Okay, so you might be thinking, okay, what are we supposed to do? And if you don't know by now, I'm never going to give you a little tidy to-do list. So there's no clear solution. There's maybe no solution at all. And I think that kind of solution-based thinking, we're already heading off into the wrong track. Because it's not just about the robots, it's about the entire atmosphere and the soil that we are inhabiting. And so there is not like a quick fix. But that's more fun and interesting anyways. Bayo Komalafe, who is in a later episode in this season, talks a lot about refusal and how an answer like, let's just get rid of the robots, let's refuse robots, let's refuse AI, for example. In that absolute and stark refusal, we continue the same kind of mechanical cause and effect thinking that brings about these kind of technologies. And he talks about how if you say, let's think outside of the box, is really a box-like way of thinking. He writes on refusal that saying no is not refusal. You could say no and still be transfixed by the question, the logic of the act. Refusal is not merely refusing. Refusal is non-legibility. That's more troubling than saying no. Let me go one more time here. Saying no is not refusal. You could say no and still be transfixed by the question, the logic of the act. Refusal is not merely refusing. Refusal is non-legibility. Non-legibility. That's more troubling than saying no. Ugh, I love this. I love this concept of illegibility. And it moves well within this conversation we have about predictability. To become non-legible within the system, not to refuse it and let that refusal become such a deep part of our identity that we are known to ourselves as being the one who refuses AI, who refuses the machine, who refuses the robot. And I can tell you that I have absolutely had that be a defining part of my identity for a while. In that harsh, absolute refusal, we are also clinging on and keeping that which we refuse alive. So we can soften and slip in more mysterious and surprising ways, finding a sense of curiosity and interest in these machines, as I did in the robotics lab. I have ideas from Nora Bateson in her book Combining called Intimate Activism. I'll leave you with these thoughts, ending, of course, with Nora's words, where she reminds us that we are not made of cubes. And then finally, with my dad's music. We had real fun picking the music for this one. We thought the bassoon, it was an inherently funny instrument. And so there's a real playfulness with this robotic piece we put together. Nora Bateson talks about this idea of intimate activism in her work Combining. Intimate activism, as I understand it, it is not necessarily loud or clear to anyone else. It is perhaps messy and small and unspoken because it is intimate, very particular, not to be replicated from one place to another. Intimate activism is something we may offer each other simply, powerfully, profoundly by looking each other in the eye when we say hello, taking a pause, a real one, before jumping into the meeting. It is asking a friend for a walk. It is helping somebody with their groceries into their car. It is the breath I took the other day when I was rushing through the house trying to take care of the children and a sick parent. The breath that was so needed to just sit on the bed and chat aimlessly so that my interaction with my sick parent was not based on me just trying to check the list of care duties, or rather a moment where we could really meet one another so much better for them as it was for me. And just the shoulders drop and there's ease that comes on the other side of that, a real opening and sense of possibility. I'm thinking of Gustavo's podcast episode before, is that the slowing down is not the destination. It is not the end point, but it is the place where you might be able to have these sort of myriad possibilities and options and things that surprise you come up, but you're slow enough to actually be sensitive enough to them. So you can perform some intimate activism today. And remember, it doesn't have to be just with humans. It could be with your house, as I am building this relationship with the stones that make the house that I live in. As I spoke about in the intro to the episode with Corinna Lyle, episode 2B that's already out. It could be with the birds, the worms, the sidewalk, trees, the atmosphere, space. But try out this intimate activism as a form of affirming something that we spoke about at the beginning. Here are the words from Nora Bateson. I am not made of cubes. I am a beast, a vermin, a stray. There is wildness still coursing through my veins, sinking me to life. It is from here that I hope to learn from life. With those words, I send you into the funny, strange music that we came up with for this episode, Ready for Bots. Have a giggle at the bassoon, follow it along, and play with its tempo. And I'll meet you next week with 2 episodes. Wild trickster energy coursing through both of them. We have Tom Hirons, the amazing poet, and Mina Salami, the wonderful, provocative feminist writer. Thank you for joining me.